everyone. Yeah, my name's John Winton. I'm a software engineer working in one of the quality teams at Spotify. I'm off-brand today. This is not a Spotify talk. I'm not talking about anything I've done at Spotify. This is going to be mostly about something I've actually used at my previous job, which was at the Guardian, which is, those of you that don't know, a big UK newspaper. And yeah, I'm going to be talking about synthetic monitoring, which is kind of something you can do if you've got kind of tests running in production, kind of black box tests and things like that, taking them a little bit further and doing a bit more with them. So I've already covered who I am. So yeah, production tests to synthetic monitoring. So we're going to talk about what actually synthetic monitoring is, why you'd want to do it in the first place, how you'd then go from taking tests that you've been running in production and turning them into a synthetic monitoring solution, and then the challenges that go with that. I'm going to have to talk very, very quickly to do this, I think, because I've got about 15 minutes. So this is a very, very long, wordy definition of synthetic monitoring, which is also known as active monitoring or proactive monitoring. It's a monitoring technique that is done by using emulation or scripted recordings of transactions. So essentially what this is saying is it's rather than, if you think of most forms of monitoring about systems, we'll look at things like error rates, number 500 errors, all that kind of thing. These are this is passive monitoring. You're reliant on things happening on your system for it to then tell you things about those. Whereas synthetic monitoring is the idea that you create these actions yourself for the purposes of monitoring, to work out what's going on your production systems. But why would you want to do this? Because we have tests, we test things, so most of my teams that I work on at the moment, we will test things before we merge code in, then we'll test it on the build before it gets deployed, and after it gets deployed we'll probably have some smoke tests in production as well to make sure that everything is fine. And that's all well and good, and then you rely on monitoring afterwards, so if suddenly you see a spike in errors, you know that something's going wrong. But what if you're in a scenario where these things kind of don't work? And this is what happened to me when I was working at The Guardian. I worked on our editorial tools team, and we built all the tooling in-house that our journalists use to create content. And whereas our website, the people who worked on our website, that team, they could rely completely on passive monitoring to know what was going on in production, because they were getting millions of hits per day. If they rolled something out, they could tell something was wrong very, very quickly because their passive monitoring would tell them. Whereas our editorial tools probably had about 12 concurrent users at any one point. If you've got an editorial team of about 1,000, but not very many people writing things in or particularly publishing content at the same time, it's very, very little. Passive monitoring isn't going to tell you really anything about that. So what we tended to have was we would deploy something, we'd run out kind of our smoke tests in production, and be like, oh yeah, cool, everything's fine. And then a journalist would come over about anything from 2 days to an hour later and be like, everything's wrong. And we'd look at our dashboard and say, no, it's fine, it's fine. And then everything would start going red. So our monitoring was slower than our users coming over and saying this doesn't work. So you get we have this kind of perfect storm of having, and as our product manager put it, having no idea what's going on in production, because we got all this great monitoring set up. We were testing in production as well. It didn't tell us anything. And this sort of scenario, you hear about it happening loads to people these days. Because if you think back in the day when people used to deploy like once every 2 weeks or whatever, production was static. Production was super, super static. So if you tested, it was basically going to stay the same. You'd have traffic fluctuations and stuff like that, but you're in a kind of a safe space. Whereas like nowadays, if the teams I was working on, everything was a microservice. We were deploying probably 30, 40 times a day across these various services. Production is just this like moving target. It's like whack-a-mole. So even if you run tests on, you deploy one of your microservices, you run tests on it, and it's great then, but then another service gets deployed and suddenly yours starts behaving differently. It's this moving target that you're trying to hit and know what's going on. So we found this gap. We needed to know much quicker what was actually going on in production. So what we started to do was we built out a system that was, we kind of took the production tests that we were already running, so we publish a piece of content and then take it down again, and we started running them continually. And so we would be publishing, about 1,000 pieces of hidden content per day, and then seeing what happened with them. What's my next slide? So yeah, and how long have I got? Enough time, I think.
You're fine.
So yeah, So when we first started doing this, we hadn't heard of the term synthetic monitoring. We were just like, let's just run our tests like constantly, get them to tell us things, see what happens. And we later found out, we thought we were great, we'd invented something new, then we found out it's actually called synthetic monitoring, and people have been doing it for ages. So we felt considerably less clever then. But we started this really, really low-fi. We had some tests, I had a Jenkins box, and I would just have a cron job just running them. And then it starts to kind of scale up what you start thinking about, what you can do. So kind of being quite generic, but in terms of, I'll kind of use examples from some of the systems that we built, but what you'd actually need if you wanted to start running tests in production as synthetic monitoring. You immediately start thinking about testability. So using the example of the piece of Guardian content, we had the ability to hide content and only be able to view it from within our building, from our network for ages. So we could publish a piece of content and no one externally would ever find it. But one of the other things we wanted to monitor was taking content down, because that's the scariest thing for a newspaper. If you can't publish, that's embarrassing. But if you publish something that turns out to be incorrect, you could get sued for libel, all that kind of thing. So being able to take stuff down is super, super urgent. That was actually the scariest thing. So we were building this system really to know that, because takedown doesn't happen very often. It's like you always want to know it works, all the time. So we started finding things like, we're building testability that we could hide content. But then when we started doing this constantly, we're taking down a piece of content basically every 30 seconds. It turned out our legal team they get a report automatically every time a piece of content gets taken down. So we scared the crap out of our legal team for a few hours. They were like, what is going on? So then we had to start thinking of how this is reaching. You are testing production, you've got to be super, super safe. So you need to be at a point where your users aren't going to see anything. So building testability into your system to kind of allow it to be able to do this kind of stuff. So yeah, staying hidden, clean data, and no user impact. You don't want a user to ever notice this. So also the other thing that came up, because we were going to be publishing an actual piece of something to the website, it was incredibly hard to find, but just in case anything went wrong with that filtering or anything like that, we're like, well, this piece of content, what's it actually going to be? And someone said, oh, you could just do a fake news article. Okay, yeah, right. So we then spent a bit of time with our legal people and cleared that we would do, we'd have a piece of content that is completely clear about what it is. It says, I am test content, and it's kind of a small blog post explaining why it exists. I mean, don't go on theguardian.com and try and find this, you won't find it. It's basically impossible, but just in case anything ever goes wrong with it, we're covered. What was next? So scheduling. So I said we started off with kind of a cron job and then started to scale this up into a service on its own. And other places where I've done this subsequently, this is kind of the really tricky part. Is like, how often do you want to be running tests? If you're doing something super, super simple, you're just hitting certain API endpoints or something like that, you could be doing this constantly, incredibly, incredibly fast. That can then mean you're producing an awful lot of data to pass through and things like that. So kind of getting the scheduling right for what you're doing. So I mean, for instance, this Guardian piece of content we do, because of how long it took to run the test, because we were doing, it was a full browser automation kind of based test, because we wanted to use things as it simulate actual user actions. That actually took quite a long time to run. So we could just kind of, as soon as one finishes, start the next one and keep going, because it would take about 30 seconds to a minute to run. But the scheduling is something that's quite tricky to get right, and most test frameworks, if you're using an out-of-the-box test framework, it normally doesn't have something for run this continually forever. So you have to kind of build that out yourself. And then you get onto alerting and reporting. So if you think also, almost every test framework is geared around pre-production testing. So every time, when you run a test, whether it's red or green, that triggers an action. So if something if the tests are green, all good, merge your code, do your deploy, whatever. If they go red, all right, investigate, is something wrong with the test, have you broken something, fix it. Whereas if you're running tests continually in production, if they go green, great, you don't care. Think everything's fine, keep them going. If it goes red, you really want to know. So, and it's not, you don't want to just have kind of a dashboard or your Jenkins job suddenly shows red. You want to know really quickly because it is production. So you're then hooking this kind of, by this point, very augmented test framework up to all your alerting. So things like PagerDuty, that kind of stuff. You want to get paged in the middle of the night when this sort of stuff happens. And similarly, how do you clean up after yourself? So if you're creating test data, what's going to happen to it? Depending on what kind of system it is. If you're just, say you're just hitting API endpoints, that's fine. But when we were creating pieces of content, if something failed, if it was successful, get rid of it, clean it, make it go away. If something breaks and you find an issue, you want to keep that data there for as long as possible because you want to be able to investigate from it. So having rules around how you're cleaning up after yourself, how you're maintaining your data is really, really important in this. So that's basically how we did it. Super quick. This is actually like a 45-minute conference talk that I've condensed into 15 minutes. So there's no screenshots or the usual massive amount of GIFs or anything like that. But yeah, this is just kind of an idea of how you can go from basically the standard test framework and the things you need to build around it to be able to start doing synthetic monitoring. But it does come with a lot of challenges. So first one being your tests need to be incredibly robust. So again, saying before, when I was saying each test creates an action, if you think about it, quite often when you're in those sort of scenarios for a regular testing framework, say your tests probably get run, I don't know, like 15 times a day or something like that, and test accuracy is a thing people are super concerned about in the testing and quality industry. But most tests, usually, this is purely anecdotal from talking to lots of people, there is nothing scientific behind this. Most people's tests run with about a 95% accuracy, probably. So that means if you're running your test 15 times a day, you're going to see like one incorrect failure. And that's what I mean by accuracy. When if the test is green, everything's good. If the test is red, everything is bad. It's not a problem with the test. If you're going at like 95% accuracy, that's absolutely fine if your tests are being run 15 times a day because you're only going to see that problem come up once a week. And that's probably, it's not ideal, but that's kind of proportional, like the effort to go any further. But then, if you're running your tests several thousand times a day and they've got 5% of flakiness, that is an awful lot of alerts. And particularly if you've hooked this up to kind of your paging system and you're woken up in the middle of the night, you're going to really, really piss people off. So your tests have to be so robust. If it's something you're just hitting it, using an HTTP library and hitting endpoints, pretty easy to do. If you're doing stuff like simulating user actions, kind of doing browser interactions and stuff like that, that's really hard. It's a massive amount of effort. So the system that we built to publish the content, probably about 65% of the time we spent on it was there was all the effort to build out this kind of product that could do this. Most of the time was spent on getting tests like minutely, like perfect. Which also kind of touching on that, keeping the noise down. Like if you are going to have test flakiness, it's going to happen. We got to we worked it out, it was about like 99.92% accuracy. You're still going to get some false positives, weird things happen, the internet happens, stuff slows down, all that kind of stuff. So you need to have tolerance. You can't alert on everything. Someone I worked with who was doing this, his team just owned like a regular backend API. They use test retries. A lot of test frameworks have, you can annotate your tests and say, retry, if it fails, just do it again. And that for them was kind of fine. For us, we started doing that and then realized we missed all our intermittent issues. So if you're running things loads and then you say, oh, if it fails, just run it again. If that's okay, cool, don't alert anyone. So we built in a kind of a tolerance into our system that the test runner was aware of the last 20 test runs. And so if you got one failure, it kind of went into a warning state, and because it was quick enough, if it failed again anytime within the next 20, then you alert because you've probably got an intermittent issue, something's going wrong. So having these kind of tolerance levels in your system when you're going to be running these tests over and over and over again, just to deal with those kind of slight inaccuracies that you're going to get. And that kind of also touches on trust. That is the absolute biggest thing with this. If you've got a test framework and your test suite, and your tests kind of go red quite often and they're unreliable, you know exactly what happens. Everyone starts ignoring them. No one pays attention. It's like, oh, the tests are red again. Who cares? It happens. With this sort of stuff, you've got to be, if you're going to be, actively creating events on your production systems and then alerting people with it, you've only got one or two chances to do that. If you wake someone up in the middle of the night and it's, total bollocks, everything's fine, they're not going to trust your system. They're not going to trust you either. So they're going to ignore your next good idea as well. So building up trust with this, and we had great success with this. So I only let it alert myself for the first 3 months, which did lead to getting woken up a few times. But if it's depriving you of sleep, you're super focused the next day, if a little crap at code, because you've been working up all night. But it got to the point where once, I was happy with it and rolled it out to a few other people on the team, and it got to the point now where I met up with the product manager from this team. I haven't worked there for a year. Met up with him a few weeks ago, and he was like, it's still going. It's still trusted. They did a full database migration, replaced, they're using MongoDB, they switched to Postgres. And they're like, oh, everything's fine, and then this went off, and they're like, oh, yeah, cool, it's still going, it's still working, and it was finding stuff, the sort of things that they wouldn't have been finding through regular monitoring, or they would have found very, very slowly. So yeah, that is basically it. I realise I've spoken very, very quickly, but thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?
In terms of running these tests in production,
yeah.
Have you had any issues with performance infecting your actual users? How have you handled that?
Okay, so the question was, did you see any effect of this on performance? No, not really. Not in this one. Not in this particular example. Other times I've done synthetic monitoring, I definitely have. But not on the primary systems. It was kind of knock-on effects in other places. Suddenly we had, Sentry, the thing for kind of logging errors and stuff like that, they actually have a rate limit that's really hard to hit. It is possible to hit that if you're doing this. So kind of little things like that around it, kind of hitting rate limits in places, yeah, that can happen. But again, it's that testability thing. You've got to make sure there's no effect on the user. Even if you are spamming Sentry, you're annoying yourself, you're not annoying the user. The user's the priority.
Yeah, thanks. So if you're coming from an environment where you're testing a lot of pre-production and you're trying to do end-to-end tests and stuff, it would be quite comfortable doing we'll test this edge case pre-production, this edge case, and then if you're switching to more testing production mindset, some of those things become less feasible. What did you find was the useful way to prioritize okay, this is where we're going to spend our effort trying to make the things end-to-end work really well versus not? Yeah.
Okay, so the question, to summarize it, was how do you prioritize what you're going to do this with? Do you go after every edge case, or do you focus on certain things? Is that a good way of summarizing? Okay. So the best way to think of this is not to think of it as testing. You're kept saying tests.